Welcome back to the channel, and if you are new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we post supernatural romance stories every single week, and you do not want to miss what we have coming for you. Today's story is one that I have been personally obsessed with since the moment the idea came to me, because it takes a dynamic that we all love in supernatural romance and flips it on its head in the most delicious way possible. We are talking about an alpha. King whose wolf knows something his human heart refuses to accept, and the beautiful, composed Omega woman who unknowingly becomes the center of a war between a man and his own instincts. So get comfortable, grab your favorite drink, pour yourself something warm, and let us dive into this story together. The morning that changed everything in the kingdom of Valdros began the same way most mornings in the royal capital did, which was to say it began with bureaucratic noise, the shuffling of parchments, the murmur of advisors outside closed doors, the distant sound of training soldiers in the courtyard below the east wing, and the low, constant hum of a kingdom that never truly slept. King Cale Draconis stood at the tall, arched window of his private study, one hand resting against the cool stone of the sill, his dark eyes tracking the movement of the guards below with the practiced detachment of a man who had long since stopped seeing the world as beautiful and started seeing it only as something to be managed. He was 31 years old. He had been king since he was 24. He had been a widower since he was 28. And in those 3 years since Mara's death, he had done what alphas of his bloodline had always done when grief became unbearable, which was to convert it into function, to pour every drop of feeling into strategy and governance, and the 1,000 small acts of ruling that kept his mind occupied and his wolf quiet. His wolf, for its part, had been relatively quiet for 3 years. That was about to change. "Your Majesty," said Lord Aldrich, his chief advisor, pushing open the study door with the confidence of a man who had served 2 kings and feared neither of them. "The Voss delegation has arrived. Councillor Emmerich Voss and his daughter. They are in the green reception hall as instructed." Kyle did not turn from the window immediately. He let another breath pass, watching a young guard fumble with his spear in the courtyard before a senior soldier corrected his grip with brisk efficiency. Then he turned. "How early are they?" 20 minutes, Aldrich said, with the faintest approval in his voice, because punctuality in the court of Valdros was a political statement, and arriving 20 minutes before a summons was a statement that said, "We respect you enough to wait rather than make you wait." "Good," Cale said simply, and moved to gather the documents on his desk that pertained to the matter at hand. A border renegotiation between 3 minor pacts that required the signature and personal endorsement of Councillor Voss, who controlled the eastern trade roads and whose cooperation was not optional, but whose goodwill was easier to secure through courtesy than command. He did not think particularly about the daughter. She had been mentioned in the briefing as a courtesy addition to the delegation, a social nicety that Emmerich Voss apparently extended whenever he traveled to court, bringing his eldest child along for what was described in the briefing notes as familiarization with royal proceedings. Kyle had glanced at the notation and moved past it. He had no interest in socializing with the Voss family beyond what the negotiation required. He could not have known, walking down the corridor toward the green reception hall with Aldrich at his shoulder and 2 royal guards flanking him at respectful distance, that his wolf was already awake. It was subtle at first, a warmth in his chest that he attributed to the strong tea he had consumed at dawn, a slight heightening of his senses as he approached the hall, which he told himself was simple alertness, the natural sharpening that preceded any political meeting. When he pushed open the tall double doors and stepped inside, the scent hit him before anything else did, and it was not overwhelming, not the thunderclap that mated wolves described when they found their fated pairs, not the dramatic sensory explosion that the old stories promised. It was quieter than that. It was like catching the scent of rain on a summer afternoon when you had forgotten what rain smelled like, and your body remembered before your mind did. Alara Voss was standing beside the tall bookcase that lined the left wall of the reception hall, not because she had sought out the books, but because she had politely stepped away from the center of the room to give her father space to conduct his greetings with the junior advisors already present, and in doing so, had ended. Up near the shelves, and had, apparently, found one of the spines interesting enough to tilt her head slightly to read it. She was wearing deep blue, a color that made her warm brown skin glow, and her dark hair was arranged with the kind of elegant simplicity that spoke of someone who understood that restraint was its own form of statement. She was not the most conventionally striking woman Cale had ever encountered at court, but there was something about the quality of her stillness, the way she occupied space without demanding it, that made his eyes stay on her longer than he intended. His wolf stirred. It was the first genuine stirring in 3 years, and it was so unexpected that Cale actually blinked, as though the internal sensation had manifested visibly. It had not, of course. No one in the room noticed anything. Emmerich Voss turned from the junior advisors and bowed with practiced grace. A man in his mid-50s with silver at his temples and the alert eyes of someone who had spent his entire career reading rooms. "Your Majesty, the kingdom honors us with this audience." "Counselor Voss," Kyle said, and his voice came out entirely normal, measured and authoritative, because 31 years of being Cale Draconis had taught his exterior to remain calm, regardless of what his interior was doing. "Thank you for making the journey. I trust it was comfortable." "More than comfortable, sire. The roads through the northern pass have improved considerably since last autumn. Your infrastructure projects are already bearing results. Flattery, but accurate flattery, which was the only kind Cale respected." He nodded. Then, because protocol required it, and because some part of him that was not entirely rational wanted to look at her again with a proper excuse, he shifted his attention to the young woman who had turned from the bookshelf and was now standing with her hands loosely clasped, watching the exchange with calm dark eyes. "And this is your daughter," Kyle said. Not a question. A prompt. "Ilara," Emmerich said, with the particular warmth fathers reserve for introductions they are proud of. "My eldest. She has accompanied me to court several times in the last 2 years, though I believe this is her first formal audience with your Majesty." Ilara stepped forward the correct number of paces, and lowered into a curtsy that was precise without being stiff. When she rose, she met his eyes with a steadiness that most people in the throne room did not manage. "Your Majesty," she said, and her voice was low and clear, unhurried. "It is an honor." His wolf pressed against the inside of his ribs like a hand against glass. Cale said, "Welcome to court, Miss Voss," and turned to direct the group toward the seating arrangement that had been prepared for the negotiation, and did not examine what had just happened inside his chest, because examining it would have required acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would have required a conversation with himself that he was not prepared to have. The negotiation took 3 hours. Ilara sat slightly behind and to the right of her father, in the seat designated for accompanying members of a delegation who were present as observers rather than participants. She did not speak during the proceedings unless addressed, which she was not, and she did not fidget or look bored or do any of the things that people who were merely tolerating a long political discussion tended to do. She listened. Cale noticed this from across the table with the peripheral awareness of an alpha whose instincts were currently more engaged than he would have preferred, and the listening bothered him more than inattention would have, because it suggested intelligence, and intelligence in a beautiful woman who smelled like rain and cedar, and something warm he could not name was a complication he did not need. When the session concluded, and the documents were signed, and the appropriate courtesies exchanged, Emmerich Voss was escorted to a guest suite to rest before the evening meal, and Ilara was left briefly in the corridor with a junior advisor who was explaining the layout of the guest wing. Kyle passed them on his way back to his study and paused, for no reason that he would later be able to adequately justify, and said, "Miss Voss, if you have not yet seen the East Garden, I recommend it before the light changes. Lord Aldrich can arrange an escort." It was a perfectly ordinary thing for a host to say to a guest. He did not know why saying it made his wolf settle with something that felt horribly like satisfaction. Ilara looked up at him with those steady dark eyes and said, "Thank you, Your Majesty. That is very thoughtful." And then she smiled, just slightly, just at the corner of her mouth, and said, "I noticed you have a first edition Carver Archive volume in the Green Hall. I did not know you collected historical cartography." He stopped. He actually stopped walking for half a step, because that was the spine she had been reading, the one he had acquired from an estate sale 4 years ago and placed in the green hall, mostly because it completed a set, and there was nowhere better for it, and no one had ever noticed it or mentioned it, because no one who came to the green reception hall was there to look at books. He said, "I do not collect it precisely. I simply could not let that particular volume go to auction without acquiring it." "Understandable," she said simply. "The third section alone is worth the price." And she turned to follow the junior advisor, and Kyle stood in the corridor for a moment longer than he should have before continuing to his study, where he sat down behind his desk and looked at the wall for approximately 30 seconds before picking up the next document that required his attention and deciding firmly that the encounter was unremarkable and he was not going to think about it further. His wolf disagreed, but his wolf was currently being ignored. The Voss delegation was scheduled to remain at court for 5 days, standard for a negotiation of this complexity. On the second day, the first suitor appeared. His name was Lord Fenwick Drayle, the second son of a powerful Western pack lord, and he had been at court for his own purposes for the better part of 2 weeks when Alara arrived, and her arrival had apparently redirected his attention entirely. He was 26, handsome in a blonde, uncomplicated way, and possessed of the particular confidence of a man who had been told he was charming for so long that he had stopped questioning it. He intercepted Alara in the East Garden precisely where Cale had recommended she visit, which was either coincidence or strategy, and launched into conversation with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times before. Kyle was not in the East Garden. He was in his study, which had a window that overlooked a portion of the East Garden, and he was working, and he happened to look up at the sound of voices below, and he saw Fenwick Drayle standing close to Alara with that expression on his face, and his wolf erupted. It was not subtle this time. It was a sudden, savage surge of territoriality that moved through Cale's body like a wave, tightening his hands on the document he was holding and sending a low growl up his throat before he clamped down on it. He stood up from his desk. He walked to the window. He looked down at the garden where Alara Voss, who was not his, who was a guest and a counselor's daughter and entirely none of his business, was politely listening to Fenwick Drayle describe himself, and his wolf pushed against every rational thought Cale had with single-minded, furious insistence. Cale pressed one hand against the window frame and breathed through it. He was the king. He was 31 years old. He was not going to let his wolf drive him to behave like a jealous adolescent alpha over a woman he had spoken to exactly twice. He turned from the window. He sat back down. He picked up the document. And 5 minutes later, when he looked up again, and Fenwick Drayle was standing even closer to Alara, and had apparently made her laugh at something, he gave up pretending he was capable of working and moved to the door of his study to find Aldrich. "I need you to reassign Lord Drayle's morning appointment tomorrow," he said, when Aldrich appeared. "To the afternoon. I have use of the receiving chamber in the morning." Aldrich looked at him with the careful neutrality of a man who had been in royal service for 20 years, and knew when he was watching a king make a decision based on something other than governance. "Of course, Your Majesty," he said, and did not ask a single question, which was one of the many reasons Cale kept him. Cale went back to his desk and read the same paragraph of the same document 4 times without absorbing a single word of it. "If you are already invested in this story, do me a favor and hit that like button right now, because it helps this channel more than you know, and I promise the next part of this is going to make your jaw drop. Keep watching." On the 3rd day of the Voss delegation's visit, 2 more suitors materialized. This, Cale learned from Aldrich with the studied blankness that was beginning to characterize all of Aldrich's reports on this subject, was not entirely coincidental. Word had apparently spread through the court that Emmerich Voss's daughter was visiting and was of courtable age, and several noblemen who had been aware of Alara Voss in the abstract had decided to make their interest concrete. There was Lord Brennan Ashwick, a pack heir of moderate means and excellent reputation, who managed to secure a seat beside Alara at the morning meal through the simple tactic of arriving early and claiming it. And there was the more concerning option, which was Duke Harlan Morrow, who was 43, twice widowed, in possession of the largest pack territory in the southern reaches, and who had sent Alara a formal gift of flowers that morning through a servant, accompanied by a card that Kale had absolutely no legitimate reason to know the contents of, but somehow knew within the hour anyway. His wolf's reaction to these developments was, by now, something Kale was grimly familiar with, which did not make it easier to manage. What made the morning meal particularly difficult was that Kale attended it, as he attended all formal court meals, and found himself seated at the head of the long table with Alara visible 3 seats to his left across the table, with Brennan Ashwick at her side talking about his family's hunting grounds in a way that suggested he found himself very interesting, and Alara listening with the same calm, attentive expression she brought to everything, which gave absolutely no indication of whether she found Ashwick compelling or tedious, or anything in between. The growl that built in Kale's chest during that meal was the quietest he had ever produced, so contained that he was reasonably certain no one could hear it, though he noticed Aldrich, seated to his right, go very slightly still at one point, in the way that meant he was hearing something he was choosing not to respond to. Kyle picked up his wineglass and drank slowly, and looked at the candles on the center of the table, and thought about the border negotiations, and the infrastructure reports, and the supply chain issues in the Northern Territories, and every possible thing that was not the fact that Brennan Ashwick had just made Alara smile, and his wolf wanted to overturn the entire dining table. After the meal, Alara sought him out. Or rather, she was moving through the corridor toward the library, and he was moving through the same corridor in the opposite direction, and they met in the middle, and she stopped and greeted him with the composed courtesy she brought to every interaction. "Your Majesty, I wanted to thank you personally for the recommendation about the garden yesterday. The light at that hour was exactly as you described." He realized she meant the comment he had made in passing, the throwaway host remark, and that she was thanking him for it specifically, as though it had been a meaningful gift rather than a courtesy formula. Something in him shifted. "You returned this morning as well," he said, and then wondered why he had said it, because it revealed that he knew she had been in the garden that morning, which he knew because he had looked out the window at a time when he had no particular reason to be looking out the window. But Alara simply looked mildly curious rather than suspicious. "I did. The north corner has some unusual heliotrope that I had not encountered before. I asked the head gardener about them." Of course she had. She had found the one remarkable botanical feature of a garden that kings walked through without noticing for years, and had sought out the specific expert to discuss it. Kale said, "They were imported from the coastal territories 4 years ago. My wife preferred coastal flora." The words came out before he had consciously decided to say them, and they landed in the air between them with a weight he had not intended. Alara did not flinch from it, or deflect it, or perform the awkward condolence that most people offered when Mara came up, which she rarely did because Kale rarely allowed her to. She just held his gaze for a moment and said quietly, "They are very beautiful. I think she had excellent taste." And then she inclined her head and continued down the corridor toward the library, and Kyle stood in the hallway for what was becoming a recurring amount of time in these encounters, and felt his wolf go absolutely, completely, profoundly still, in a way it had not done since Mara was alive. On the evening of the 3rd day, Duke Harlan Morrow requested a private audience with Kyle. This was not unusual. Morrow was a man of consequence and had legitimate business at court that predated the Voss delegation's arrival. But when the Duke settled into the seat across from Kale's desk with the comfortable authority of a man who was used to being comfortable everywhere, he said, after dispatching the official business in 20 minutes, "I will be direct with you, sire, as I always prefer to be. I intend to pursue Alara Voss. I am telling you this not as a request for permission, as she is of course free to receive whichever courtship she chooses, but as a courtesy, since I am aware that her father's relationship with the crown makes this a matter of some sensitivity." Kale's wolf went from still to incandescent in approximately 1 second. Kale's face did not change. This was the benefit of 7 years on the throne, that his face had learned to be entirely separate from what his interior was doing. He looked at Duke Morrow with level dark eyes and said, "I appreciate the courtesy, Duke Morrow. Miss Voss is indeed free to receive any courtship she chooses." He paused. Something his wolf was doing required him to pause. Then he said, "I would, however, note that her father's extended stay at court over the next 2 days means that any formal courtship proceedings would need to respect the professional nature of his visit." Morrow's eyes sharpened slightly. He was not a stupid man. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I would not dream of being inappropriate." But there was something in the careful smoothness of it that made Cale's jaw set slightly, and when the Duke left, Kyle sat for a long time in the quiet of his study and had the conversation with himself that he had been refusing to have since the green reception hall. His wolf wanted Alara Voss. This was now undeniable. The growling at suitors, the hyper-awareness of her location at the morning meal, the strange stillness that her voice produced in his chest, the fact that a casual comment about a book had lodged in his mind and refused to leave, the way the mention of Mara in connection with her had come out of him unbidden, but had not felt like a wound the way it usually did. These were not random data points. They were a pattern. His wolf had recognized something in Alara Voss that his human mind had been refusing to process, and every suitor who approached her was activating a territorial response that was going to become impossible to manage if he did not figure out what he was going to do about it. The problem, Cale thought, was not that he could not pursue her. He was the king. He was a widower. She was unattached and of age and from a family whose alliance with the crown was already strong. There was no procedural obstacle. The problem was that he was not sure he deserved to pursue anyone. Mara had loved him with the full force of an Omega's devotion, and he had not been able to protect her when it mattered, and the grief of that had not killed him. Only because kings did not have the option of being killed by grief. He had converted it. But conversion was not healing, and he knew the difference, and the idea of bringing someone else into the space that Mara had occupied felt like a form of recklessness he had not permitted himself. His wolf's opinion on this was unambiguous and colorfully expressed in the language of pure instinct, which was that grief was not the same as death, and that whatever Alara Voss was to them, it was not something that could be compared to or measured against what Mara had been, because it was its own thing entirely, and the wolf did not understand why the man kept trying to make comparisons that made no sense. Cale sat with all of this for a long time. Then he picked up the pen on his desk and returned to the documents that needed his attention, and did nothing, because he was not ready, and he at least had the self-awareness to know that not ready was better than wrong. On the morning of the 4th day, everything collapsed into chaos, as things in the kingdom of Valdros had a habit of doing. At the worst possible moment, the report arrived from the northern border at dawn, hand-delivered by a messenger who had ridden through the night, and it outlined a situation that was not yet a crisis, but was moving in that direction with the purposeful momentum of things that intended to become crises. Cale spent the first 3 hours of the morning in emergency session with his war council, and the Voss delegation was not on his mind at all during that time, which was one of the benefits of genuine emergencies. When the session concluded and the initial response measures were dispatched, Cale moved through the corridor toward the east wing with his mind still fully occupied by troop repositioning logistics and supply line calculations, and he turned a corner and very nearly walked directly into Alara Voss. She stepped back quickly, and he caught her arm without thinking, just the automatic reflex of someone preventing a collision, and for one moment, they were closer than they had been at any point during her visit, and his wolf did something that was not growling and was not the territorial surge he associated with the suitors, but was instead something much quieter and much more devastating, something that felt like recognition, like the interior equivalent of a door opening into a room that had been locked for 3 years, and Cale released her arm and stepped back and looked at her and said nothing for a moment that lasted approximately twice as long as it should have. "I beg your pardon," Alara said. "I was not watching the corridor. The fault was mine," Cale said. He was looking at her with an attention he had stopped pretending was casual. "I was distracted." She read him. He could see it happen, the way her eyes moved across his face and gathered information with the quiet efficiency she brought to everything. "There was a report from the north," she said. Not a question. It reached the guest wing through the usual channels by which these things travel. "What do people in the guest wing know?" he asked, and it came out more direct than protocol dictated. but he was not capable of protocol at this precise moment. That there is a situation. That your war council met this morning. That you are handling it. She paused. Then she said, "Is there anything my father can do? The eastern roads fall under his jurisdiction. If supply lines are relevant, he would want to offer." The precision of it struck him. She had assessed the information available to her, identified the specific asset her family represented, and offered it without being asked. He said, "I will speak with your father. Thank you." And then he said, because it came out before he stopped it, "You are very calm." "So are you," she said. "And I would guess you have considerably more reason not to be." Something moved through him. He said, "I have been managing crises for 7 years. The calm is a learned behavior. So is mine," she said simply. And that was the most personal thing either of them had said to the other in those 2 small sentences. And the corridor was quiet around them, and his wolf was absolutely not growling, and was not surging, and was simply present in his chest, with the focused, intent stillness of an animal watching something it had decided it could not let go of. If this story is making you feel things you were not prepared for this morning, you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already, because we do this every week, and I want you to be here for all of it. Emmerich Voss's assistance with the northern supply lines proved genuinely useful, which meant the political relationship between the Voss family and the crown was strengthened by the crisis rather than disrupted by it, which was the kind of outcome that good fortune and well-positioned allies sometimes produced. The 5th and final day of the delegation's scheduled visit arrived with the northern situation stabilized enough to be managed by the appropriate channels, and Emmerich Voss began the preparations for his departure with the satisfied efficiency of a man who had accomplished his goals and exceeded them. Fenwick Drayle, who had not given up, made one final attempt to secure Ilara's attention on the morning of the 5th day. He found her in the library, which was where she had spent considerable portions of her mornings, and he sat down across from her with a bouquet of flowers that had been procured from somewhere, and said things that Cale did not hear, because he was not in the library. He was in the corridor outside the library. He had walked past the library on his way to a meeting that was in the opposite direction of the library, which meant he had taken a route that was inefficient and illogical, and which he had taken without examining why. And now he was in the corridor outside the closed library door, and he could hear, through the excellent acoustics of the old stone walls, the low murmur of Drayle's voice and the quieter sound of Ilara's responses. His wolf was growling. It was not the contained, suppressible growl of the previous days. It was deeper and more insistent, the kind that started in the chest and wanted to come out the throat. And Cale pressed his hand flat against the stone wall of the corridor and breathed very carefully, and had a direct, non-negotiable conversation with himself about the fact that he was the king, and he did not pace outside libraries growling at men who were talking to women who were not his. Except, he heard Ilara's voice through the wall say, with the particular measured politeness she used when she was being kind but firm, "Lord Drayle, I appreciate the sentiment. I want to be honest with you, because I think honesty serves us both better than ambiguity. I am not interested in pursuing a courtship at this time. I hope you will accept that graciously." There was a pause. Then Drayle said something Cale could not quite catch. Then Ilara said calmly, "That is kind of you, but my answer does not change based on persistence. It is simply no." And his wolf, which had been growling, went quiet. Not the quiet of suppression, the quiet of something that had heard what it needed to hear and was considering what it meant. Cale stood in the corridor for another moment. Then he moved to the library door, not because he had a plan, not because he had made a decision, but because something in him was moving and he had stopped trying to pretend he could override it. He opened the door. Drayle looked up with the expression of a man who had not expected to be interrupted. Ilara looked up with the expression of a woman who was mildly surprised, but not distressed. Cale said, with the calm authority of someone who was not required to explain himself, "Miss Voss, I was hoping to have a word with you before your departure, if you have a moment." Drayle took his flowers and left. He was not, Cale noted with his wolf's quiet satisfaction, a foolish man. Ilara set down the book she had been attempting to read with graceful patience through the whole encounter, and gave Kale her full attention. "Of course, Your Majesty." He walked to the chair across from her and sat down and looked at her and said, "I am going to say something that may be inappropriate, given the context." "All right," she said. She sounded entirely unalarmed. He said, "I have been behaving in a manner that has been confusing to me for the last 4 days. My wolf has been objecting to the presence of every man who has attempted to court you during your visit, with a persistence and force that I would describe as unreasonable, if I were also not aware that wolves are not unreasonable. They are specific." He paused. Ilara was watching him, with the same focused, quiet attention she had brought to the negotiation session, to the garden, to the corridor conversation. She said nothing. He continued, "I am not in a position to promise you things. That would require certainty I do not yet have. I am a widower. I am a king. My life is complicated in ways that would directly affect anyone close to me, and I am honest enough to acknowledge that. But my wolf has spent 4 days telling me something that my human sense was trying to refuse, and I have found, in my experience, that refusing the wolf eventually produces outcomes worse than listening to it early." He stopped. The library was very quiet. "What is the wolf telling you?" Ilara asked. Her voice was entirely level, and her eyes were steady, and she was doing that thing she did where she gave the impression that whatever he said was going to be received with the same calm intelligence she brought to everything, which made it easier to say things he had not said out loud before. He said, "That you are important, that it will not tolerate people who are wrong for you moving closer to you without stating its position, and that I should stop pretending I do not understand. Why? Because I do understand why. I simply was not ready to." He looked at her. "I am telling you now not because I am ready to make promises, but because you are leaving today, and my wolf will not forgive me for letting you leave without saying it." Ilara was quiet for a moment. The light from the library windows was warm and still. Then she said, "I turned down 5 men in 4 days." "I know," he said. "Did your wolf understand that those refusals were not coincidental?" He looked at her. He said, "Did you know about the wolf?" "Not know," she said. "But I am an Omega who has been raised in a court-adjacent family, Your Majesty. I notice things. Your wolf growled during the morning meal. I heard it." He felt heat move up the back of his neck. It was, he suspected, the closest he came to embarrassment. "I apologize for that. I am not complaining," she said simply. And then she said, "I am also not in a position to promise things that require certainty I do not have. In the eastern reaches. I have a life. I have commitments to my family and my own work. I do not want to be a consolation for grief." He felt that land, and it did not make him angry because it was accurate, and she had said it with the quiet precision that he was beginning to understand was simply how she operated. He said, "That is a fair condition. And I do not want to be a political arrangement. Also fair. And I would want to know you, not the king. The person who could not let the cartography volume go to auction." Something happened in his chest. His wolf made a sound that was not a growl, that was softer and completely ungoverned. And he was very glad that wolf sounds below a certain threshold were not audible to other people. He said, "I would like that as well." Ilara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "My father returns to the eastern reaches today. I do not have to go with him." He heard what was underneath that. He said, "Would you stay? If there were a reason?" She said, "There is," he said. And that was not a promise. It was not a declaration. It was the first honest thing he had said to her, without the wolf forcing it. The first thing he had chosen with his full self, rather than just the instinct he had been fighting. And it settled into the space between them with the particular weight of beginnings. She stayed. Not permanently. Not with the grand gestures that the court would have expected if this had been a formal courtship. She stayed for 2 more weeks. And during those 2 weeks, she met Kale in the library in the mornings, and they talked, not about politics, or not only about politics, but about cartography and coastal flora, and the specific problem of converting grief into function, and whether that conversion was a coping mechanism or an avoidance strategy. And he told her about Mara with a directness he had not managed in 3 years. and she listened without filling the silences. And his wolf was at peace in a way that no longer disturbed him. The court noticed. Courts always notice. The whispers began with the library mornings and accelerated when Cale walked with her in the East Garden twice in 1 week and was observed smiling, actually smiling, by 3 junior advisors who reported this event to Aldrich, with the barely contained excitement of people who had worked for a grieving king for 3 years and had genuinely feared he would not come back. Aldrich received these reports with dignified composure and added them to his mental file without comment. Fenwick Drayle left court on the 6th day of Alara's extended stay. Duke Morrow sent a very correctly worded letter of withdrawal to Emmerich Voss that contained the minimum possible reference to the king's apparent interest and the maximum possible dignified acceptance of changed circumstances. Brennan Ashwick, who was as pleasant as reported and more perceptive than expected, sent Alara a note that said simply, he wished her well and hoped the library treated her kindly, which she found so gracious that she told Cale about it. And Cale decided to ensure that Ashwick received a favorable resolution to the minor land dispute he had been navigating through the court for 2 months, because perceptiveness and grace deserved acknowledgement. Emmerich Voss, for his part, had a private conversation with Cale on the 8th day of his daughter's extended stay, a conversation that he initiated by simply arriving at the study door and requesting 5 minutes, and which consisted of Emmerich looking at Cale with the direct eyes of a man who had spent his life reading rooms and saying, I want her to be happy. That is the only thing I want. If you are not going to make her happy, I need you to say so now, because she does not always advocate for herself the way she should, and I will advocate for her even against a king. Kyle said, I understand that. And I will tell you, as directly as I can, that I intend to make her happy, and that if I find I am failing at it, I will tell her rather than pretend otherwise. Emmerich looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, she told me once, years ago, that the man she was with would have to respect her. Know the same way he respected her, yes. She said that was not negotiable. Cale thought of the corridor outside the library. He thought of Alara's voice saying that her answer did not change based on persistence. He said, I know. Emmerich Voss nodded. They shook hands. It was as things went in the court of Valdros, remarkably undramatic. Do not go anywhere. We are approaching the moment this whole story has been building to, and I need you to stay with me for this next part, because it is going to be worth every single second. Duke Morrow did not accept changed circumstances as graciously as his letter suggested. This became apparent 6 weeks into Alara's extended stay at court, when word reached Cale through the intelligence channels that ran beneath all royal operations, like underground rivers, that Morrow had entered negotiations with Emmerich Voss's political rivals in the Eastern Territories, and that the nature of those negotiations included references to Alara's position at court as evidence of what one document described as the Voss family's strategic overreach. What it meant, translated from the language of political maneuvering, was that Morrow was attempting to build a coalition that would pressure Emmerich Voss through economic and territorial leverage, and that one of the stated goals of this pressure was to extract Alara from the court situation and redirect her toward a different arrangement, one that would specifically benefit Morrow and neutralize the Voss family's growing closeness with the crown. It was, Cale noted with the cold analytical part of his mind, a sophisticated play. It did not directly threaten Alara. It did not involve him directly. It worked through channels that would take weeks to become visible to anyone not specifically looking for them, and by the time the pressure became apparent, the economic damage to the Voss family holdings could already be considerable. His wolf's reaction was not sophisticated. His wolf's reaction was the same surge of protective fury that had built since the first morning meal, except that this time it was not directed at a man talking to Alara in a garden. It was directed at a man attempting to move pieces on a board to take something away from them, and the distinction made the response considerably larger in scope. Kyle sat with the intelligence report for approximately 40 minutes. Then he made 2 decisions. The first was operational and practical, and involved Aldrich, and 3 members of the Political Intelligence Division, and a carefully targeted sequence of counterpressure that would redirect the coalition Morrow was building before it achieved critical mass. This took an hour to outline and several weeks to execute, but was well within the standard toolkit of a king who had been playing this particular game for 7 years. The second decision was not operational and was not practical and required nothing more complex than walking from his study to the library, which was where Elara was, and finding her at the reading table by the north window where she preferred to sit, and placing the intelligence report on the table in front of her and saying, "I need you to see this." She read it. She read it with the focused, unhurried attention she brought to everything, and when she finished, she looked up and said, "This is about my family." "Yes, and it is because of me being here. It is because of Morrow's unwillingness to accept no," Kale said, "which is Morrow's problem. But yes, the proximity to me has created a target." He watched her process this. He could see it happening, the particular quality of stillness that meant she was thinking rather than reacting. She said, "What are you doing about the coalition?" "Already handled," he said. "Or in the process of being handled. The counter-strategy is in motion." She looked at him. "You are showing me this not to alarm me, then." "I am showing you this because you told me you wanted to know me and not only the king," he said. "And this is what the king's life looks like, underneath the dinners and the library mornings. This is what it would mean to be close to me. People will try to use you to reach me, and they will try to reach you to move me, and you deserve to look at that with complete information before you continue." He met her eyes. "I am not trying to push you away. I am trying to ensure that if you stay, you are staying with the full picture." Elara was quiet for a long moment. The library light was gold and still around her. Then she said, "You know what I appreciate most about this conversation? Tell me, that you did not try to protect me from the information to protect my feelings," she said. "You gave me the truth and trusted me to, handle it." Something moved through him. He said, "I would not have given you less than that." "I know," she said. "That is why I am going to say what I am about to say." He waited. She said, "I am not frightened of Morrow or his machinations. I grew up in a political family, Kale. I have been watching people use leverage and build coalitions since I was old enough to sit in my father's study. I am not a political innocent who needs to be protected from the reality of your world." She paused. "What I would need, if I stayed beyond what has been extended already, is to be treated as someone capable of standing in that world with you, rather than someone who needs to be insulated from it." He had not been expecting that. He had been expecting, at the outer reach of his hope, that she would appreciate the transparency and perhaps agree to continue as things were. He had not been expecting her to stand up from the reading table and cross the distance between them and look at him with those steady, dark eyes from a foot away, and tell him, essentially, that she wanted in. His wolf did not growl. His wolf did not surge. His wolf went completely, unutterably still, in the way it went still when something it had been reaching for finally came within reach. He said, "I would not treat you any other way." "Good," she said. And then, because she was who she was, she picked up the intelligence report and said, "Walk me through the counter-strategy. I may have useful context about the Eastern Coalition members that your intelligence division does not have." He almost laughed. It came out more as an exhale that carried warmth in it, which was, he thought, the closest he had come to laughing in 3 years. He said, "Sit down. And yes, please." They worked for 2 hours. Her knowledge of the Eastern Territory power structures proved, as she had predicted, genuinely useful, and when they finished, and Aldrich had been updated with 2 additional strategic elements courtesy of Elara Voss's political education, she looked up from the papers and said, "This is better than being in the library." He said, "You are welcome at the table whenever you wish." It was not a proposal. It was not a formal declaration, but it was something more than the library mornings and the garden walks and the careful beginnings, and they both knew it, and neither of them felt the need to translate it into more words than it required. 3 months after Elara Voss arrived at court for a 5-day diplomatic visit, in a ceremony that was private by Kale's specific instruction and attended by only the people who mattered rather than the full spectacle that tradition would have demanded, Kale named Elara his formal companion. the acknowledgement that preceded betrothal in Valdrosian protocol, and that carried legal weight in matters of protection and standing. He gave her a suite of rooms in the wing adjacent to his own. He gave her a seat in his strategy sessions that was not ceremonial, but functional. He gave her access to the intelligence channels that ran beneath the court like rivers. And his wolf, which had growled and surged and pressed against the inside of his ribs for 3 months of suitors and uncertainty, and the slow, difficult work of someone learning to open a door they had believed was sealed, settled into a state of profound and permanent quiet. Duke Morrow's coalition collapsed within 6 weeks of Cale's countermeasures taking effect. Morrow himself retreated to his southern territories with the carefully managed grace of a man who understood he had overplayed his position. Kyle sent him no punitive measures and no public humiliation, because the counter-strategy had been surgically sufficient, and because Alara had made a mild but clear observation that unnecessary cruelty rarely created the outcomes that justified it. He had agreed. Not because she said so. Because she was right. Fenwick Drayle, having left court, encountered Alara 6 months later, at a regional gathering, and greeted her with the uncomplicated warmth of someone who had moved on and wished her well. Alara introduced him to Cale with perfect grace, and Cale shook his hand with perfect courtesy. And his wolf, for the first and only time in Drayle's presence, did not growl at all. Drayle, who was a perceptive enough man to notice this shift, made a comment afterward to a friend about how different the king seemed, looser in some way that was hard to name, and the friend had looked at Alara across the room and said, "I think I can name it." And Drayle had laughed and said, "Yes, probably you can. Here is what no one in the court of Valdros knew, or what only those who had been paying very close attention suspected, which was that the morning in the green reception hall, when Cale had turned from the window and walked toward a 5-day diplomatic meeting with Alara's father, and the scent of rain and cedar had moved through the air of the corridor, like something half remembered, his wolf had known immediately and completely, with the certainty that animals have when they bypass the long route of human rationality and arrive directly at the destination, that Alara Voss was important in a way that was going to require the rest of him to catch up. The wolf had not explained this to Cale in the language of feelings, because wolves do not use that language. It had expressed it in the only vocabulary available to it, which was behavior, which was the growl at every man who came too close to something it had claimed without being given permission to claim it, which was the stillness when she spoke, which was the surge when she was threatened, which was the quiet when she offered herself as a partner rather than a companion, and which was, finally, the deepest peace it had known in 3 years, when Cale stopped arguing with it and simply agreed. The betrothal took place 8 months after the visit. It was announced at a formal court dinner and received with the particular flavor of court enthusiasm that comes when an announcement is surprising, but feels, in retrospect, inevitable. Aldrich, upon being given the news 20 minutes before the announcement, because Cale believed in giving the man who ran the practical operations of his life appropriate warning, said only, "I will begin the arrangements, sire," and then turned away, and did something with his expression that may or may not have been a smile, and that he would categorically deny if asked. The arrangements were excellent. Alara sent her father a letter the night of the announcement that Cale did not read, and was not shown, and which she described to him later only as telling him I am happy, and that I am staying because I want to, and that he was right about the heliotrope. He did not entirely understand the last part. She explained that Emmerich Voss, who knew his daughter's habits, had once said that a person who was genuinely happy could find something to admire everywhere they looked, and that the heliotrope in the garden were her proof of evidence. He thought about this for a long time. He thought about how he had mentioned the heliotrope and Mara in the same breath in a corridor months ago, and had not understood until this moment that he had been, in that small moment, beginning to let something in, rather than holding everything at the threshold. He told her this. She listened in the way she listened to everything, and then she said, "I know. I could." "Tell," he said. "You could tell from a mention of flowers?" "I could tell," she said, "from the fact that you mentioned her at all. People who are fully closed do not volunteer the things they are protecting. You mentioned her before you were ready, and I thought, there it is. He is already opening. He looked at her. He said, You have been paying very close attention. I told you, she said. I notice things. His wolf made the soft sound again, the one that was not a growl and had no aggression in it. And it settled in his chest, like something that had finally found the place where it was supposed to rest. There is an epilogue to this story, because the best stories always have them. 2 years after the morning in the green reception hall, King Kael Draconis and Queen Alara Draconis stood together at the window of the same study where he had first looked out over the courtyard and not understood what was beginning. The northern border situation had resolved into a treaty. The eastern territories were stable. The political coalition that had tried to use Alara as a lever had become, ironically, one of the strongest frameworks of the crown's eastern diplomatic strategy, because Alara had spent 2 years quietly building relationships with the very people who had been mobilized against her, not through manipulation, but through the same quality of clear-eyed, genuine attention she brought to everything. And human nature being what it is, people who are seen clearly and treated honestly tend to become loyal. Kael had discovered over 2 years of partnership, extraordinarily good at governance. Not in the same way he was. He was strategic and decisive, and moved quickly through the calculus of power. She was patient and thorough, and understood that the most durable structures were built slowly, and by consensus, and these were not competing approaches, but complementary ones, and the court that resulted from their combined presence was demonstrably better than the court that had existed before she walked through its doors and tilted her head to read a book spine in a reception hall. At the window, she was looking at the east garden, where the heliotrope were in their second spring flowering. He was looking at her. She felt him looking, and turned, and the expression on her face was the one he had spent 2 years learning to read, which was the one that meant she was about to say something precise and unexpected. She said, "Your Wolf picked correctly." He said, "I am aware. I am not sure you told it thank you." He was quiet for a moment. He felt his wolf inside him, present and calm and utterly without conflict, the way it had been since the day she had sat across from him in the library and told him she was not frightened. He said, "I believe the correct thing to say is that I am grateful for its insistence. That is diplomatic. I am a king. Diplomacy is my professional strength. And cartography," she said. "Do not forget cartography," he said, with the warmth in his voice that had started quiet and small in the library mornings and had grown into something that had taken up permanent residence in him. "I would never forget cartography." She laughed. It was the sound he liked most out of everything the palace contained. He turned back to the window and looked at the garden, and felt, with the full, unreserved weight of someone who had traveled the long way around to get there, that this was where he was, supposed to be, and that the wolf had known it from the first morning, and that the only thing that had ever been required of him was to stop arguing with it long enough to agree. And that is the end of our story today. If this one got to you, if you found yourself rooting for Kael from the moment he stood outside that library trying not to growl, or if you fell in love with Alara's particular brand of quiet strength the way I did while writing her, then please let me know in the comments below, because this channel runs on those conversations, and I read every single one of them. Tell me your favorite moment. Tell me which character you connected with most. Tell me if you want more stories about alphas who are defeated by their own wolves before they are ever defeated by love, because honestly, that might be my favorite kind of story to tell. Drop a like on this video if you have not already, because it helps more people find their way here, and this little community deserves to keep growing. Subscribe if you are new, hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story, and I will see you next time with something just as good as this one, maybe better. We will see. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourselves. And remember that sometimes the most honest thing about you is the part that does not have words for what it knows.